So I've been on a nostalgia kick lately, so I gave myself a challenge. What would it be like to use Windows XP and only Windows XP for 3 days? Well, I did just that, but here were the rules. Anything I had to do, whether that be script writing or classwork, had to be done only in Windows XP. All software I used on Windows XP had to be from the late 90s to early 2010s. Any software after then were released after XP had lost support, thus making the experience not as authentic. And if I wanted to use a search engine, I would have to use the very limited version of Google that is usable on Windows XP. With that said though, I did allow myself a way to still get work done since these rules were rather restrictive. If I needed to use modern utilities like Google Classroom or a modern video editor like DaVinci Resolve, it was perfectly permissible to use my Mac to access those functions. But if I wanted to play back any of the content I made, I had to transfer that file onto the XP machine and watch it on there. I also had to write all the essays that I were assigned in Windows XP and transfer them onto my Mac. Luckily, I was only assigned one while I was conducting this experiment. Also, full disclosure here, I used a VM for all of this, so it's not a fully authentic experience. My goal with this challenge though is to see how restrictive using XP would be 9 years after support ended, so that minor detail doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. With that said though, let's jump right into the challenge. Day 1 was rather simple. It was a school day, so I didn't have as much freedom as I would have had I conducted this experiment on the weekend. As a result, I couldn't really record my reactions or anything while doing this, so that's a bummer. Still though, I tried to make the best out of the freedom I did have, so yeah. I spent an hour or so installing XP Delta in a virtual machine. I chose Windows XP Delta because, in my opinion, the added content packed into the ISO makes it a great piece of software to just play around with. Once I got to the desktop, I began to play around with some settings and see what I could do with the software. I hadn't used XP in a full capacity like this since 2015, so it was kinda interesting to relearn all the shortcuts and features nearly 10 years later. But honestly, that was the end of day 1 because I spent the rest of the day messing around with FreeCell and Minesweeper instead of paying attention in class. I also installed Microsoft Encarta 2003 and played around with that for a bit. I always thought that having a software encyclopedia that you could use offline is far better than Wikipedia that always needs to be online. One of the things I found interesting about XP throughout this entire experience is that Windows honestly never really changes. Like, okay, I use Mac, right? But my secondary machine runs Windows 11, and going from 11 to XP doesn't really feel as much of a radical change as I thought it would be. Especially because Windows 11 and Windows XP were released an entire 20 years apart. But yeah, with day 1 being over, day 2 was rather short, as most of the work I had to complete had to be done on Google Docs, which wouldn't even work on Windows XP. So, not much to say for day 2. Day 3 though was honestly the biggest day. So I'm taking a class in TV video production, so I had to write an essay about a famous director. I don't watch a lot of movies though, so that was honestly a really hard thing to write about. I ended up settling on writing about our Primo, who was a news director that's credited for creating the eyewitness news format. I want to be a journalist, so this essay sort of just aligns with what I want to do, which was great. But guess what? My stupid ass decided to procrastinate until the day before the assignment was due, so I spent a solid 45 minutes, if not more, to rush this essay out. Luckily, writing an essay on a topic you're already passionate about makes the experience much less painful, so that definitely helped. Also, I already knew what sources I wanted to use, so all I had to do was just write the actual essay. Sadly though, most of the websites I wanted to use for sources wouldn't even work on XP, so I had to switch between the VM and Firefox on my Mac a lot. Again, this wasn't a major issue, it was just kind of annoying. Luckily, before the school day was out though, I had a fully written essay, written completely for the most part in Windows XP. For this I used WordPad, which is an app I now hate. Don't get me wrong, WordPad is a good app for people who can't afford Microsoft Word, but the only real way I could export the file onto my computer was through RTF, which made the formatting kind of wonky once I opened it up in Apple Pages to then export as a PDF. Again, minor inconvenience, but it wouldn't be a proper video if I didn't bitch for 10 minutes about minor annoyances. After that, I installed Microsoft Office 97, which is what I used to type up all the handwritten notes I had made for my history class. I exported that file as a doc file, which luckily for me opened up real nicely once I transferred the file over onto my Mac. But yeah, after that was the end of day 3. So let's answer the question I had when I first did this mini experiment. How restrictive is using Windows XP in 2023? Not too restrictive as long as you're not trying to use modern anything. Obviously, this should go without saying, but using XP on the internet is a risk. Not as big of a risk as people make it out to be, but still a risk nonetheless. It's sort of like STDs. There's a load of them out there, but as long as you're not being reckless, you should be fine. With that said though, it's funny because software from back in the 90s and 2000s seemed to be way better built than software from today. For example, I love the fact that I can use Microsoft Word without having cloud stuff being shoved in my face. Nowadays, software is subscription based too, which sucks because now instead of having the software be high quality from the offset, companies are just focused on fixing the issues gradually through updates as they continue to pull money out of your pockets. Adobe, I am looking at you specifically. And okay, side rant, Adobe software is the buggiest piece of shit software in the existence of the earth. The fact that people pay monthly to be raped by Adobe is nuts. Like, how do you pay $20.99 a month, if not more, to have Premiere Pro literally crash on you in the middle of an edit? DaVinci Resolve is free and it doesn't even do a half of that. But Adobe Rant to the side, there's so much content added to these old pieces of software too. For example, Microsoft Encarta. Honestly, Microsoft Encarta is the best software for people who just love searching for things all day. I can spend hours browsing through Wikipedia and not get bored as is. But having all that completely offline is more valuable than I think Microsoft even realizes. Especially in an academic setting where the internet can be a bit of a distraction. So yeah, all in all, this is a neat experiment that I would totally try again. It takes me back to a time when using Windows XP, owning a BlackBerry, and listening to MP3s on an iPod Shuffle were normal. Ah, what a time.